Okay, so we are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Dare to DPM LinkedIn live session. Today, we have a special edition focusing on the EU AI Act in particular, but I think in general, we will discuss the regulatory landscape for AI across the globe. We have amazing panelists and guests for today. So we will start by doing a short introduction of each panelist and their company so that you also know in which direction you can ask your questions. So Peggy, why don't you start, please?
Sure. Thank you, William, and thank you to Mindfield for putting this event together. I'm so excited to be here. I am the Chief Data Officer of BigID. BigID is an AI machine learning data discovery platform. We were founded about 8 years ago to really help identify personal and sensitive information to be in compliance with GDPR. And I think that we all know that with all the privacy regulations, it certainly evolved the way that companies now not just think about privacy, but also fundamentally data governance. And with that, also data security. So we think about the whole entire data lifecycle management and being able to protect and secure the information, data that's going into not just the inputs of what your companies are collecting, and but also now thinking about the outputs of the data models, and especially with generative AI. So really excited to be here to talk about not just the EU AI Act, but certainly the impacts to that in the US and privacy and security as well.
Thank you, Peggy. Gary, can you go next, please?
Absolutely. Thank you, William. My name is Gary LaFever. I'm co-CEO at Anonos and very excited to be here. Mindfield's mission, as I understand it, and it's one of the reasons I'm so excited to be here, is to actually enable companies to better measure and maximize the value of data. And I think this is something that people don't associate with regulation, and why I think this session today is so important, because what Anonos focuses on is technical controls that enable you to literally leverage regulation for your competitive advantage by using sensitive data. And just very quickly, to me, what's interesting is I think the EU AI Act is a natural progression from the GDPR and then the Schrems II ruling, and now the EU AI Act. And to me, what's changed or evolved over all three of those is the importance of technical measures, and technical measures that actually can show accountability, because policies and procedures and treaties are simply not enough anymore. And later on, I hope to share some specific metrics that I have that shows how much of an issue AI can be, both with regard to downside and upside. But it's a great opportunity to be here, and thank you, William and Mindfield, for the invitation.
Thank you, Gary, for being here. Robin.
Thanks so much, William, as well, for the invitation. I couldn't be excited and to discuss today with Gary and Peggy. I think this is going to be really interesting. A bit background on myself and Apheris. So I'm the CEO of a company called Apheris. What we do is we help organizations safely connect data across organizational and geographical boundaries and make such data compliantly available for advanced analytics and AI. So the problem we are tackling is the following. We see, on the one hand, more and more models becoming available in model libraries or from private model vendors. So those are pre-canned models out there that you can use. And for most businesses, the way to build truly differentiated applications is to take those models and then customize them on differentiated proprietary data. Now, obviously, the moment you build new AI applications and you process data, you come into the challenges of how do you fulfill the security requirements that you have? How do you fulfill the privacy and regulatory requirements? How do you protect IP and demonstrate compliance? And so we support that with a product that leaves data where it resides and brings computations to such data and classifies these computations when they come into the data and when they go out. And so via that, we help fulfill regulatory requirements, but as well often commercial considerations. So the product is as well used when multiple organizations want to essentially collaborate on data, but still protect their IP, not diminish it. And so there, Apheris is used to help these companies build data networks and gain access to broader and more diverse data. So really, really excited to be speaking with all of you today, and hope to both learn and contribute. I mentioned earlier that I'm certainly as well still a learner in that field as well. So I have strong opinions weekly held. Very much looking forward to the discussion.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone. And for those who don't know me, so I'm William. I work at Mindfuel. And as Gary was saying, our vision is to generate business value by leveraging data. And the way that we think and we are convinced that you can do this is by bringing product management best practices into data and analytics teams, to keep it short. So welcome, of course, to our audience. If you want, you can also introduce yourselves in the chat. While we get warmed up, I have prepared a couple of questions for our panelists so that you also know in which directions you can ask. So maybe now we start the round on the other direction. So I will start with Röhm. So I was thinking, Robert, that Apheris focuses very strongly on enabling analytics on distributed data sources, right? And maybe you have a single model that you want to bring into multiple jurisdictions. So what is your approach to complying with the local regulations, right? Because if you have one model across multiple regulations, do you have a heuristic?
Yeah, great question. And indeed, so we follow a federated approach in our in our model. And so a big value that we see is that data stays within the existing environment and does not get moved. The advantage there is really that the existing ways for organizations to assess whether they can process the data according to the use cases that they adhere to, and as well the processes that they might have in place, say in the EU, a data protection impact assessment to assess that these can still be applied in the same manner, because again, all data is being processed within the environments that organizations use already today. Now, when you look at the concept of federation, it's still federation itself does not solve compliance problems. But if you let's say if you add the necessary controls, both when compute jobs are sent to data and then when compute results are retrieved from data, so incoming and outgoing guardrails, if you add these controls, then you can address essentially the local applicable law or regulation that you need to adhere to. And so that's essentially what we provide with our product. But these controls are the same controls that you would have to do when you process data for internal purposes.
Okay, thanks, Röhm. So, by the way, Peggy and Gary, at any time, if you want to interrupt, ask another questions, everything is allowed here, right? So it's a free conversation. But Gary, so moving forward, so one of the key elements of this regulation is that it's a risk-based approach, right? So it means you'd have to classify all of your models, and depending on the risk category that you get, the compliance requirements are different. And I think we have seen this already in the data area, right? Where we said, if you follow these requirements, you will have different degrees of liberty, like with pseudonymization, with anonymization. So we had the same with data. So what's your opinion on this? So if you understand well the requirements, do you think that we can even get a competitive advantage out of regulations?
Absolutely. And I think that there's four levels of risk. There's unacceptable risk, which you're not even allowed to process. There's high risk, which requires certain risk mitigation techniques. There's limited risk, and there's minimal risk. The consistent theme through the three different categories that you're allowed to use is the obligation to have risk mitigation in place. And I want to say something that may seem self-evident, but a lot of people don't process it. contracts and procedures and treaties do not mitigate risk. They allow for a remedy after something bad happens. They do not prevent that from happening. And that's something I think that a lot of people haven't gotten from either the GDPR or Schrems 2, which is the requirement of technical supplementary measures to stop bad things from happening. So the reality is, no matter what category of risk you think you have under the AI Act, you have to show the technical risk mitigation that's in place to keep it at that risk and no more. I think, in my mind, one of the biggest issues with the EU AI Act is that it's saying that you need technical controls to mitigate the risk so individuals' rights and companies' trade secret rights. I mean, I like what Robin said, right? It's not just about personal data. It's also about trade secrets. It's about IP. It's a broader category. So if you look at the very clear requirement of risk mitigation showing that you're preventing bad things from happening, okay, I think that allows you to embrace that and then be better off for use of data, whether it's under the GDPR or in the US under the CCPA or whatever it happens to be, or international data transfers. And so I think that's recognition of technical controls, when embraced, becomes a technical enabler for more competitive advantage.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. I agree with you, Gary. And I love the emphasis on the technical part of it, because I think for the most part, what I've seen from a data governance point of view, a lot of organizations have not been focusing on leveraging the technical metadata to help automate the identification and security and prevention and these controls. And I think we all agree in this room today that it's not just going to be the EU AI Act. There's in the US, there's going to be more stringent AI regulations, and a lot of it is so undetermined that the only way to gain not just a competitive advantage, but to be proactive in privacy and AI regulation is to have a strong technical metadata understanding that can be the building blocks for your governance, for your data, for your security and privacy. And then that's how you can build the models that Robin talked about to help with the insights and analytics.
Yeah. So I think a trend that we're seeing is the regulations that we had in the past were focusing a lot around data. And now it seems that we are moving out of regulating data and regulating what we are doing with data, right? The analytics. And I remember, Peggy, when I first saw BigID, this was one of the main value propositions where you said, okay, you have this data, and instead of you manually going and checking all of the data sources that you have, we will help you automatically tag this and tell you, is this relevant? This is not relevant for the regulation. So what are strategies that we could follow to do this also with AI models?
Great question, William, because fundamentally, I see data as the building blocks, right? It's almost like when you're a child, you play with Legos. These are discrete things that does need to be managed, because that is fundamentally the biggest question that organizations have is, what is my data? What are my data assets? Where exactly is it? What is the data quality of it? And now the additional processing, business processing is how can I use it? Do I have the permission to use it? Do I have the right access to use it, right? So it's a slow build, I would say, in terms of how we are now building this building, right? In terms of now we got the building blocks for the data. We're thinking about the actual usage and the application of it. And certainly when BigID was conceived as a company, it focused on the discovery of where personal information is. And that evolved over time, because it's not just personal data, it's like, confidential IP, anything that's sensitive, that's meant to be kept within the walls, the confines of your organization. So anything that is what we call in data governance critical data elements, your crown jewels that you want to protect and guard, how do you make sure that it's not accidentally used in your training sets? How can you ensure when you're building your large language models, and through your prompt engineering, you're not accidentally leaking any of this information. So the automatic identification and classification of this information still needs to apply to AI models. And that's where our technology of discovering and automatic classification and tagging that can help manage and put the right controls in place for the AI data lifecycle.
Thank
I,
you. So, yeah, Robin, please.
I just wanted to comment on that. I fully agree to what Peggy said. And I think as well, even without the EU AI Act, just looking at GDPR, right, there is essentially you classify data sets into different categories. And I think that's what Peggy, you just described, what BigID does particularly well and easy. And so you have like different forms of classifying what is entailed in that data. And then depending on that, you have purpose-based limitations. And you see these coming up more and more across different legislation. So we work a lot in healthcare. If you look into the European Medicine Agency guidelines, if you look into software as a medical device, like in all of these examples, there's as well purpose-based limitations being described. And so purpose is obviously not just a function of the data, but it's a function as well of how is that data being processed. So already existing legislation in many cases provide similar building blocks that you need in place to support with these technical controls. And those are controls on the data set level, but it's as well controls on the computation level, right? How do you classify computations in the first place? Are they where have they been pre-trained in the UAI Act as well? How, let's say, compute efficient was all of that? What transparency do you have where this pre-trained model comes from? And then once you have a trained model and you distribute it, what are the properties of that model? Is it fair? Is it biased? Is it trustworthy? Is it explainable? And depending on these properties of the trained model, you can use it for different purposes. And so as well, Gary, to what you said, these technical controls allow you at each stage of the life cycle, assess that and define which data sets are you able to provision for which type of purposes, and how can you distribute a resulting model depending on its classification. And I think that's the broader theme that we see across literally all the legislations, at least, that we have to deal with.
Yeah, totally agree. And what we often find is the corollary or complement to purpose is place. And the reason I say that with AI is really one of the powerhouses behind AI is what's known as a GPU or graphical processing unit. These are more advanced types of processing units that can process, particularly parallel processing, at 100 times or greater from central processing units. Why does any of that matter? Because these are expensive if you have to buy them and maintain them themselves. And so most companies are looking to use those in the cloud. And so going to what Robin was talking about, federated, what version of the data are you taking to the cloud so that you can use the GPUs that are there? And so you have both purpose limitation and also what I would call place limitation, right? Which is, okay, when you're at the place where you're doing the processing, what limitations or restrictions are imposed because of that location versus your home country or member state location. And so I think you're absolutely right, Robin. The EU AI Act, to me, that's why I kind of draw it as a continuum between the GDPR and Schrems 2. You don't comply with the EU AI Act and not take consideration of those or healthcare or research, or you have to have them all. But I think if you approach it as it gives you the means to help manage all of these, right, by discovery and classification, by federating in a way that is manageable, documented, okay, and helps to prevent the bad things from happening, that's where it's a competitive advantage.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions already coming in, but I just want to stay here for a second because I think this is a super interesting conversation, because I was thinking the other day about this. So large language models, right? So we have GPT, we have Gemini, but we know that these models are trained on a lot of data, and this is also global data. So why does it seem that people are training these models and creating them without any regulations impacting them, right? So if, for example, the EU AI Act will come into place how will this impact the the development, but also the use of foundational models in companies? So how are you thinking about that?
Well, my own personal view is that this is going to have to be addressed at a political level. Okay. You've got the Italian DPA who's looked at certain things that OpenAI is doing. You've got the Danish DPA who's saying that you can't make use of data off the cloud, off scraping. That's going to have to be addressed. That's already under the GDPR. It has nothing to do with, well, I shouldn't say it has nothing to do, but that's an issue that precedes the EU AI Act. And I do think that has to be resolved, but I think that's going to require a political policy-based solution, because I think a technical interpretation is the current use of data that was scraped off the web is not lawfully collected. And to deny all of society the benefit of that information has to be weighed. I mean, ironically, my favorite provision of the GDPR, I know it's sad that I have one, is recital 4, where it says data is meant to serve humanity. And you need to balance the fundamental rights. Privacy and data protection, only 2 of the fundamental rights under the EU fundamental rights. And so it has to be taken into account, but I don't think it's something that's going to be addressed at the company level or even the individual member state DPA level. I think that's going to be a legislative, and if not, then a court decision as to what's the right policy answer.
Okay, this is one of the questions that we have in the chat. So imagine I'm any of your customers, right? And a lot of your customers are already using today LLMs, right? So via Microsoft or directly via OpenAI. And now we have this regulation. So how would you self-assess, right? Because we know that under the EU Act, you have to self-assess. So who should self-assess? So am I self-assessing as someone who uses the model, or is only the developer self-assessing, and which criteria would you use this? So are these models like high risk, low risk? So I thank you, Sophia, just pinned the question from the chat. So what's your take on this configuration? Because I think this is a question that a lot of people might have.
So I can start, and I'm sure we have a complementary perspective. So I would first of all, I mean, as Gary said before, right? Like there will be pre-trained models out there, and the, let's say, model providers will have duties to think about how they train them in the first place, and as well how they essentially are transparent about how data has been collected and what the rights around that are. So that's something that as a, let's say, user, well, you're not building the next foundational model, is something you can take as given, even though we not necessarily have all that information today when we consume a large language model from a given model library like Hugging Face or a private one. Now assume that's given. So you have a pre-canned model with a model card that describes all of that. I think when you say you're using that LLM, I would differentiate between what do you mean with using, right? Are you using that to query it? Are you using that to run inference on a larger set of data sets that you deploy it within your own environments? Or are you using that to customize, retrain, fine-tune, and potentially distribute within an application? And all of that has different notions, not just, again, from the EU AI Act, but as well how you process data and what that data is that you process. So again, would probably look, I mean, what we always do is we look at the data and model flow. So we make a simple graphic of what happens at each stage and what is actually the fundamental processing that you do at this given stage. And do you send model to data or data to model, and how much data is that? And where is it being sent to? What is the location? What are the laws that apply based on what moves to where? And so based on that, you can map essentially what the different privacy and compliance legislations are considerations are that you need to look at. And so again, that's why what Peggy says with classification of data helps. That's why what Gary says, technical controls help. If you know, okay, I shouldn't be sending this form of data to an environment that is not controlled, then that's something that you can do with exactly these controls. So that's my high-level response. I'm sure Gary and Peggy, you have complementary views on that.
No, I agree with you, and I just wanted to add actually to William's original comment about these type of large language models like ChatGPT, for example. I think it's quite clear in the EU AI Act in terms of being able to provide transparency, right? If you're an organization that's utilizing or building these large language models for, again, understanding the consumption use and the purpose. But I think transparency and explainability is a key part to, as almost as a disclaimer, right? Right now, I am Peggy tsAI. I'm not a deep fake or anything I'm saying are my own thoughts. I'm not using AI. So it's like that's kind of that type of transparency and explainability is also a clear part of what needs to be explained as well as that's clearly articulated in the EU Act as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's coming up here, right, is even before the EU AI Act, you had obligations with regard to your data supply chain. So I like the way Robin said it, right? You need to identify both the types of data and where they're coming from and where the processing capabilities are coming from. Because under the GDPR, you are always responsible for the data processors and third parties that you're working with. So you need to think of it as a data supply chain for which you have obligations and you have liability. And you have new laws coming up for those of you who haven't grappled with the Digital Operations Resilience Act. I love the name DORA, right? It is a law that for financial services in the EU, you are specifically responsible for others in the data supply chain. And so if you can document where the controls are, again, that's the focus of Anonos, what technical controls does your foundational model provider provide? What type of data do they provide? Now, when it's in your hands, what are you doing? What kind of data are you using as an input? What kind of data are you getting as an output? And what technical controls do you have in place? So if you view it as a data supply chain for which you have both obligations and liability, then you can show how you're intervening and helping in each one and step of the way.
Yeah. So I would say my takeaways from this section was that first, before we were thinking a lot, I bring data to the model, right? So it's a sequential process where you say, okay, I need data to train the model. But now we also have this scenario where you can have a model that you will bring it to new data, right? So the relationship is now going in two directions, which means that for these types of regulations, you have to consider both, right? So you have to consider the model and the data. So actually what this creates is like a regulatory combo that won't make the lives easier, right, to the companies that have to go in this direction. And I think this fits perfectly to one of the other questions that we've got in the chat. So it's addressed at you, Peggy, but of course everyone is happy to comment. So first of all, we have a fan of how your name is spelled on LinkedIn with AI
Thank you.
making so a word play. And the question here is, imagine you are a data governance team. How will this regulation impact your daily work? So is your scope now larger and you have a mandate to also start picking at the analytics? So what do you guys think that will be the impact of these types of regulations in how data governance teams are working today?
It's a great question, Dr. Felix Kobler. So I would say that, so I've been doing data governance. I worked in financial services companies before I joined BigID several years ago. I worked in, big banks and insurance companies, and I did data governance, right? So I was doing data quality, data operations, data stewardship work, really being in the midst of not just the business, but within technology and helping to ensure compliance, but also make sure data adds value. And this was, not too long ago. I'm talking about 8 to 10 years ago, as recently. And the focus of data governance teams was reference data management, master data management, putting together a data catalog or business glossary, and building data quality rules. So the remit was pretty straightforward. And I think that over the last 5 years or so, the role of a chief data officer and a data governance team, their responsibilities evolved because not just so it's almost like, what do I do once I've governed all my data assets and I have good data quality, I have good data lineage, and understanding the whole full supply chain of how data is used internally and externally. Companies ask, what do I do with all this investment? And they realize they can do, things like better analytics, better compliance, and privacy also came into play with managing private and sensitive information. And now I see the AI acts really helping to now accelerate, data governance teams in the past had difficulty getting resources and funding for their efforts because it was such a foundational work and it was very hard to articulate what the business outcomes were. And I love the AI Act because now AI systems are cross-functional, cutting across the business units. It is escalated directly to the very top of your business executives and the committee to really understand the value it can bring to the organization. No one disputes the value of AI and the benefits of AI, but how it can be trustworthy and safe and explainable, it all comes down to the work of a data governance team. So I wouldn't say there are any key changes that data professionals should look into, but lean into the concepts of data quality, data lineage, ensure that all data assets have this transparency and explainability, and documenting the controls and usage and flows. Those fundamental frameworks of data governance that we've all been doing for the longest time is now even more important because now the scope of that data has expanded, and the scale and the speed of which we need to demonstrate data governance value is now days instead of weeks and months.
So Peggy, I'd like to add to that and play off of something that Robin had said and why I used P for place, right?
Mm-hmm.
As purpose limitation, but also where the data is going to be processed, because data quality is an assessment of the data quality in many respects when it's in your hands. Now, if you're going to take that data someplace and process it because they have GPU capabilities, or you want to use a model, what is the version of that data that you take there to process? And you need to ensure that the data is not just of high quality in your possession, but in the where it's being processed. And the reason that's so important is particularly under the EU AI Act, in a way that yes, it was there before, but it's so more evident now. You need to make sure that the versions of the data that are being put in these models are such that they respect the fundamental rights of individuals. But not only that, they don't introduce discrimination and these other things. So I just want to real quickly give you some stats that, to me, they blow my mind, right? So a cloud service provider, there's many of them, right? These are the people who would host your AI model, okay? These are stats that we know from working with cloud service providers as CSPs, okay? Oftentimes, 80% or more of their customers' data cannot be provided to their models. If 80% or more of sensitive data, so I'm talking about personal data here, IP, confidential information, is not going into the model, how accurate is that going to be? One of the CSPs we work with has identified that more than $7 billion in government processing alone in the EU is not getting to their models because they don't feel like it's adequately protected. And now, because of these concerns, some of these CSPs are being told by their biggest international clients to shut off access to their models until they come up with a solution. So this is not something that can be ignored. So it takes some of these ideas that Peggy has raised from traditional quality and data governance, and now you have to look at it through the lens of what Robin's been talking about, okay? Where's the processing occurring? Because if the data is of high quality in your possession, but it's inferior in the possession of the actual model, you have a different issue that you need to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I was also thinking this goes in direction of innovation, right? So if you don't have like a good compliance strategy, it's not only that you won't be compliant, you can be left behind, because if you cannot unlock the power of data, then it would be hard. So we have a question from Felix saying, with your background in both legal and technical aspects, Gary, so what strategies would you recommend to balance innovation with AI compliance? Are there some specific tools or frameworks that you can share that can help streamline this process?
Thank you for that question. I may not be the most enjoyable person at a cocktail party because of the stories I like to tell. But if you do a search on the GDPR and you search for how many times 3 words appear: anonymous, encryption, and pseudonymization, you will discover that anonymous appears twice, encryption appears 3 times, and pseudonymous appears 12 to 15 times, depending on what derivation you get. I've learned from working with the regulators that that was intentional, that how pseudonymization was purposely redefined under the GDPR was intended to help people be more innovative by building the controls and the data. Because pseudonymization is redefined says you cannot relink to identity. And I would extend that to you cannot relink to confidential information to IP. Okay, let's take that definition of personal data and expand it to be sensitive data. If you cannot relink to that, but for access to data that is separately held by the data controller, again, this is going to Robin's been talking about federated, okay? If the data controller is holding those keys, as it were, additional information necessary, now you can show that because the controls are flowing with the data, you can process it anywhere. So the GDPR intended this. Schrems 2 actually tried to speak to this. It said that if you want to use standard contractual clauses, you must have technical controls. And now you get to what I consider the penultimate right now, which is the EU AI Act. By showing that the technical controls you have help to preserve the quality data that Peggy's been raising with any place that you're processing it, which is what Robin has been raising with federated learning, you now have the best of all worlds. You can show that you can go back and verify the accuracy, and it can go and be anywhere it needs to be, but you're the only party that can relink to identity or to IP or sensitive information trade secrets. That's what I would suggest. Embrace the technical controls.
Yeah, great. So I was thinking with GDPR, when it came out, there was a lot of criticism, right, worldwide, speaking again to innovation, so the same topics, but now some years after GDPR, has been established and running, what we saw is that a lot of countries or even states actually copied and followed what GDPR was saying as the new standard in regulation. So do you think that we will have the same with the EU AI Act? So will countries across the globe follow the lead of Europe and start regulating models the same way? Or do you think that it will be different this time due to, I would say, how impactful can AI be, right? So I'm thinking of countries like towards the east, where they already use AI for a lot of topics without any constraints or concerns around ethics. So do you think that we will also have like a global wave of AI regulations? I'm especially interested on your take on the main markets, right? So if you take a look at the US or Asia Pacific, what's your take on how this is going to evolve?
Please, Peggy, go.
No, I was going to say comment. I think that the level of extensiveness of the EU AI Act may not be consistent across all major regions and countries, but I think there will certainly be a driver for certain levels of expectations around the transparency and explainability. We see, for example, in Australia follows very closely with the US, and I expect, and this was something Gary and I were talking about with what the expectations are in the US, probably be very similar to the EU. So, I think that other regions will follow very closely as well. So I think there may be differences, but I think the level of expectation, I think for many countries will be to be something very similar. But Robin, you're in Berlin. I'd love to hear your global perspective from this as well.
Yeah, thank you, Peggy. So my view is, first of all, I think the criticism on innovation is probably separate to take to will let's say globally still certain regulation be adopted from companies that are more stringent. I think those are like partly separate topics for me at least. And certainly what we can say is if there's more stringent and thoughtful regulation, then of course this is beneficial for those companies that innovate with these regulations in play or inside, and then as a result of that, other companies will pick up on this when regulation come in. And I think that's exactly what we've been seeing with GDPR as well. And we see that as well, even on the US. I mean, we work a lot in health, right? Sites in the US, they don't necessarily accept HIPAA as the only thing anymore, but they do look for how can I more protect the privacy. They don't believe in de-identification according to HIPAA in some circumstances, and adapt new models orienting themselves at what they see or oversee. So generally, I do assume that there will be more interoperability across the different regulation that we are seeing. And certainly, given that let's say, the way AI is coming to market, at what speed, with what impact, is essentially addressing global security, global safety teams. I mean, we are seeing regulation across the world. And so there are just different approaches to that. So yeah, to summarize, I think, yes, we will see interoperability. We will as well see what works better for which type of stage of innovation you're in. But generally, I think what Gary said, embracing the technical controls, whether you are within the EU or outside, is a must, because even the Biden administration describes these controls, describes explainability, privacy controls, trustworthy AI in a similar manner. And at some point, depending on where you distribute your applications and what data you process, you need to have these controls in place. And the later you start, the more difficult it is to actually rebuild your entire stack in a compliant manner.
I'll make a bold statement. Under thoughtful laws, okay, and I hope that's the only kind we have, pun intended, the limitations on innovation, I believe, are brought about when people try to rely entirely on analog solutions, policies, procedures, treaties. The data processing and innovation and insight capabilities of AI and Gen AI have made those not obsolete, don't get me wrong, but inadequate by themselves. So that's why you have to look at both the extraterritorialism, that's a big one, of these laws, because you can't just say, well, I'm going to go process in the Far East so I don't have to worry about the EU AI Act. Well, what kind of data are you using, right? So it's both the extraterritorial nature of these laws and the cross-border data flows, as it were. So I think by looking at this in the way we're talking about here, you can view these as positives to your competitive advantage, but you can no longer operate or act like you're processing this data in your own data center, and that's all you're worried about.
Mm-hmm. Good. So we are approaching the end of today's session. So I think I've learned a lot today, but I want to give you the chance to make a closing statement. So if you want to give something to our audience as the last thing or a summary of the session, it would be great. So feel free to, I think, I know Gary is there. So Robin, yeah, why don't we start with you, Robin? So what would be your closing remarks for today?
My closing remarks would be, I would recommend to follow the patterns that we are as well seeing how AI from a data science perspective is being handled. And that is, we call it data-driven AI, right? If you look at the machine learning tooling out there, you see a bigger and higher emphasis on the data side. And so starting with that for most businesses is the right thing. That's why I love this discussion as well. We spoke at least 50% about the data and not just the models. I think that's critical. So starting with the data and then putting controls along the life cycle of how models flow to data or vice versa. I think that's the key to unlock a competitive advantage, which is going to be leveraging the access to proprietary data, sensitive data that companies have.
Amazing. Thank you. Peggy.
A lot of great learnings from great questions, and I think great dialogue for us. I think the key takeaway I would say to the audience is that no man is an island. What we do, regardless of your role in data privacy or security or modeling, think about the implications to other people, other environments, and be aware of the impact of what you do to others. So I would, be current and stay relevant with the current changing regulations. I think that there is no set stone in terms of what is best practices. I think it's going to be evolving, but trying to know your fundamentals in the data, but be aware of how it's applied to other people and the changing requirements. That's really up to us to stay on top of that. So.
And I would say technical controls the flow with the data to address both the issues that Peggy and Robin just raised. That's what's really changed. The more traditional approaches to protecting data through governance policies and procedures and treaties are still very important, but you need to ensure that those are enforced everywhere the data flows and is processed.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think we are exactly on time. So we also want to be respectful of your time and the time of the audience. So thank you for joining.
Pleasure.
And maybe see you in the future. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Thanks
Bye.
very much. Hey, thanks, Peggy.